Welcome to the Natasha Helfer podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
Hello, everybody. This is Natasha Helfer. This is the Natasha Helfer podcast, where we try to dismantle shame, sexual shame in particular, through education and stories and interviews in every single way we can. Today is another panel discussion with my team, Symmetry Solutions. With me, I've got Jenny Elledge from Florida.
Hello.
Hi, Jenny. She's in Orlando, Florida. She's licensed in both Florida and Utah as far as therapy goes, and also provides online coaching and wellness coaching. And then we've got Allan Alexander with us. Hi, Allan.
Hi, everybody.
And he's coming to us from, I guess not sunny California today, cloudy California today.
Yeah, it's a little overcast today.
He is also licensed in both Utah and California for therapy services, also does wellness coaching, and lots just really great team members. I enjoy working with them both. And we're here to talk about kind of, things that are coming up in the news. That's kind of what we try to address in these monthly panel discussions is what are some current events that hit that intersection between religion, sexuality, mental health, which is pretty much our specialty here at Symmetry Solutions, is kind of the intersection of those things and how people are navigating some pretty important aspects of their life. I mean, what's more important than religion, sex, and mental health, right? So
I hear you.
All right. So yeah, I was working on kind of some presentations I'm getting ready to do on trainings for therapists in regards to religion, working with religious communities. It's interesting that, as therapists, we get a lot of diversity training, but not so much in religion. So we might get, diversity training in like sexual orientation and race and culture. And even those have not always been as in-depth, or as robust as a lot of, especially minority populations would like them to be. So we're improving, I think, a lot of that in the mental health field. But religion is also a type of diversity, and we just don't get a lot of training, even though I think it was in 2015, I read that the American Psychiatric Association said, yeah, this is really important that we have training in these areas. Anyway, I digress. I'm doing research in that and trying to come up with some presentations. And in that, it's interesting to see current stories. So like, not stories that are coming out of the 1980s or 1990s, early 2000s, but just, some of these articles are January of 2023, or let's see, April of 2022. And the two articles, and I'll post these in the comments, but one of them is like 91% of Christians say mental illness is stigmatized in the church. So that's one. And then the other one is titled "The Stigma Attached to Mental Health in Religious Communities." And it seems like this shows up in kind of two different ways, if we're going to be very basic. One is public stigma. What does the religious community think about when somebody is diagnosed with depression or anxiety or has mental health symptoms? And also self-stigma, right? So what do people think about themselves? And I think, and I'd like to hear kind of what both of you think, but for a lot of years, I mean, it's interesting just to go back in the history of mental health. I mean, really churches were the ones who took care of mental health issues way back when, especially when you're thinking about maybe religious hospitals or, spaces where, I mean, I hate to use the word insane asylum, right? But we had a lot of these spaces where people with severe mental health issues or mental health issues that were not understood, and people would get abandoned or kind of ostracized from their communities because of whatever symptoms were showing up, oftentimes were taken in by religious hospitals, clinics, communities, nunneries, whatever. And so it's just an interesting history there. But then with the advent of kind of more westernized psychological help, that there kind of tend to be a rift. And not that I believe that Freud was the father of psychology, because that ignores, of course, anything that's not Western and white. But if you're going to look at the influence that Freud had on the field of psychology, he was not a friend of religion, right? And he saw a lot of things that maybe would be considered mystical or spiritual as either delusional thinking or magical thinking, and so the field of psychology for a long time, I think, was averse to religious or spiritual issues, and religions became averse to the field of psychology. I think that we even have that history in the religious background I come from, which is Mormonism, Latter-day Saintism, where there were some comments, especially back in like the 1950s and 1960s, where it was like psychiatry is like an enemy to the religious community. And so there's been kind of this interesting relationship, right, between mental health and religious ideas. And so, and I think sometimes too, religious communities can have this sense of like, well, if you're doing what's right, if you're following God, if you're doing the things that you should be doing, whatever those things are, prayer, being a good person, fasting, reading your scriptures, following whatever standards or values the religious community says are valuable, then life should be good. Life should be good, right? That the benefit of doing all those things is that you're blessed and you're doing well, and doing well means you should be, quote unquote, happy or doing okay. So if you're dealing with anxiety or depression, it's easy then to either blame the person as the community, like, well, you must not be doing something right, you must be sinning or not doing some of these things, or for the person to feel just internalized shame, like I must not be doing something right. So I think this is kind of how this shows up, both historically and just even kind of, and I think both parties share some blame. I think religious communities share some blame in this, and I think the psychological communities share some blame in this rift between spirituality and mental health. So that's my initial thoughts. What's coming up for either one of you?
Yeah, for me, I went to my master's program in the late 90s, and I remember that there was this new rise that was happening in the field of therapy, which was we get to now start talking about spirituality, because prior to that, there was a big emphasis in therapy to have this sort of blank slate approach, like we're not going to, we're not going to impose our values onto the clients, and we still don't. But vice versa, we were like really kind of avoiding the subject altogether. Like we don't talk about values, we don't talk about spirituality. In the late 90s, we started to see more research coming out of, I think a lot of it was coming from Bill Doherty out of Minnesota, and starting to talk about that there is some legitimate reason for starting to talk about religion, spirituality, values in the therapy room, and to start to get comfortable doing that. So I think part of that is the stigma is like, oh, I think for a long time we actually said, hands off, we don't talk about this type of thing. And so now we're kind of recuperating like a couple of decades later to say, yeah, this is actually something that we can talk about. And in fact, for us, we do this all the time within Symmetry Solutions. This is our bread and butter, so to speak.
I came to this field, this is career 3.0 for me. So I came to this field later in life. So I went through my grad program even after Jenny did. And by the time I was in my grad program, it viewed religion and spiritual belief and faith as a strength. So it was all part of a strengths-based approach to help people get through and cope with whatever was going on in their life. So it was fully integrated by the time I went through my grad program.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's interesting because even within the mental health community, I think there can be discussions or debate as to whether or not religion does show up as a healthy protective factor or as a problematic factor for people. And one thing I talk about a lot as well, not all religion is the same. Religions vary widely in their ability to be flexible or rigid, their ability, what certain doctrinal standards do they have? Are they realistic in the sense of how humans kind of show up, and is there room to be kind of quote unquote human? Or is the religion fairly perfectionistic, and expecting a lot of compliance, right, in order to belong to the group? So there's a whole variety of like orthopraxy and ortho belief, right? So what you believe and what you practice. So some, we see a lot of differences. For example, take sexual orientation as one example. There's many churches out there that are very LGBTQ affirming, they're very welcoming, that have gay or lesbian leaders, pastors and preachers, where people can go and show up in ways that are very accepting and inclusive, right, of their identity and of their orientation. And of course, there are many churches out there that take a pretty 180-degree approach to that, where this is something that is seen as unnatural or unholy or evil even, and a part of a person's identity that is either expected to change or expected to be suppressed, which then can, the research shows, can be very detrimental to mental health, right? And to feeling like you belong and that you can be authentic in your life while also valuing your faith tradition, and your faith community, which we do know that community is a big part of why religious traditions can be very helpful. I think, there's obviously a myriad of reasons, but I think some of the main reasons why religions can be very helpful is, one, it gives people community. Two, it gives people meaning and purpose in life. And I think spiritual practice, whatever worship looks like for people, can oftentimes be part of really, in some ways, either healthy or unhealthy coping mechanisms, right? So I think of like, even in, what's that movie where Tom Hanks is kind of a mystery person and it's the Catholic diocese or whatever, I forget now. But there's this man who's like whipping himself, right, with like self-flagellation, right, which is like a type of worship in a certain type of more extreme, I don't know if extreme is the word, or more orthodox form of Catholicism. Not most Catholics don't practice that way, but self-flagellation maybe is something that most of us would say, maybe that's not the healthiest way to worship, right, or to cope. But I think many people find prayer helpful, or meditative practice helpful, or even reading sacred texts helpful as part of their coping skills. So it just kind of does depend. I don't think that we can say it's all healthy or it's all unhealthy. It just kind of depends how it presents, and how people think about or are allowed to express their own kind of self-authority along with the religious authority. And mental health has its own authority too, right? Like mental health practitioners have sometimes elicited authority in unhealthy ways too.
The movie, by the way, The Da Vinci Code by Dan
Thank you. I can't ever remember anything.
Yes.
The Da Vinci Code, there you go.
Good movie, highly recommended.
Right. Very entertaining. So just to quote a little bit this article, it says, although not factual, people periodically use religion to perpetuate stigmas. Negative religious beliefs are sometimes used to paint a picture of an angry God that punishes or abandons his creation. This can take a toll on a person's mental health and even push them away from seeking medical help. I know that there have been some recent pastors that actually kind of in Bible Belt land who have actually tweeted or said, if your pastor is telling you to go to see a therapist, don't go back to that church. Like, so very actively kind of negative towards mental health help, right? That if you're right with God, you wouldn't need that kind of help type of a mentality. Anyway, this article continues and says, however, not everyone believes that physical and mental afflictions are a product of God's punishment and wrath. So there's an interview here with a Catherine Reinhard, who is Lutheran. And so some of the, I think it's just interesting. And by the way, the person who is doing the interview is Muslim. And so the question that Fatima asks is, how does your religion or spirituality positively or negatively impact your mental health? And Catherine responds, well, my religion positively impacts my mental health and wellness because I worship, serve, and believe in a God who never leaves me and cares about how I feel. So what's the relationship with deity, right? Is the relationship a positive relationship or is it a punitive relationship?
Mm-hmm.
She says, he knows all my inner feelings, so she sees God as a he, and I can count on him. I know I am deeply loved both by God and by fellow Christians. So it's kind of this loving, accepting space that she has carved out in her religious, kind of processing. Is that, yeah. And then Fatima says, well, how is mental health viewed in your congregation? And Catherine says, well, I think the Christian church would say that mental health issues are struggled with because there is sin in the world, but not because you personally have sinned or that you did something specific that resulted in them. Mental health is viewed as something that is important, but is deeply intertwined with spiritual health. And I believe God will help you through struggles you have, and he cares about your mental health. So it's, again, this Lutheran perspective on how this particular person sees that. They talk about scriptures, and Catherine says, well, in the book of Psalms, it's basically a journal of David and his struggles and how God knows him. So again, I've seen scripture used to weaponize mental health issues, and I've seen scripture used to help with mental health issues, right? So that's also kind of, it's depending. Do you feel the church or places of worship should offer mental health services? And Catherine says, absolutely. Do you think mental illness is viewed as a sign of weak faith or punishment for your sins? And Catherine says, I think that is a misconception, and that is how some Christians feel.
Mm-hmm.
So again, who gets to decide, right? And then Fatima says, as a practicing Muslim, I would reply that Prophet Muhammad not only acknowledged and addressed psychological challenges, but he also laid the foundation for generations of Muslim scholars to discover, diagnose, and treat mental health disorders. Reframing the perspective of emotions, embracing them, acknowledging them, taking care of oneself, seeking out cures for illness, and remembering God are all useful ways to cope with mental health, as our prophet taught us. So that is Fatima's perspective on her religious community, which again, I don't know that all Muslims would have that necessarily perspective, right? But she does.
Mm-hmm. Well, the communities are broad within each religion. And, these belief systems and the morality attached to them tend to work for the large core group of people within the religion, for the majority of people. But it's when you're not the majority that all of a sudden we start encountering difficulties, especially in the areas of mental health. Because what was a strength for somebody because it reinforced everything about who they were and how they show up in the world, can be very punitive and judgmental for somebody who deviates from that norm. So suddenly it becomes not a strength, but a punishment or a shame is visited upon them. And we see those struggles a lot coming through our doors.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can see how, if you're a person who has some mental health issues and you are going to church, depending on your congregation and how welcome types of comments like, hey, I'm really struggling with ... is welcome. People may hide what's really bugging them in life, what their real issues are. So if people are in a hiding type of congregation, then it'll be very easy to compare your lowest of lows with the highest of highs that you're seeing in the congregation, which only reinforces the idea that you're somehow a bad, wrong, broken person.
But I am encouraged by the recent, number of people, both in sports. I can think of tennis stars who've done it. I can think of sports stars who've done it. I can think of entertainment people who've done it. I think politicians who've done it. recently there's been a lot of people who actually step up and say, you know, I'm going to step back, or I'm going to take a hiatus, or I'm going to go get treatment because I'm struggling with this mental health issue. And they're being very open and public about it. And that goes a long way towards alleviating a lot of the stigma around it, because these people are role models. And I'm encouraged by another upcoming topic that we're going to talk about, where it seems like, regardless of what the church leaders are saying, the way that it's playing out in the actual communities and congregations and gatherings across the country is much more compassionate.
Yeah.
Yeah, you bring up a point I was going to mention, which is my thought of, you know, that's kind of the same thing that I'm seeing, Allan, is like, I'm surprised by this article, because I'm like, just on my social medias alone, people are talking about mental health like every single day. Like every single day, they're talking about some aspect of mental health. And that is very, very, very easy to find these days. So I feel like maybe if we're talking about orthodoxy and generation, just where I'm having my curiosity, is like, you know, what we tend to see with the younger generation is more acceptance of mental health as a thing. In fact, they heartily embrace it. Like, no, my mental health is very important to me. And we also see the younger generation leaving orthodoxy, which may leave people who are practicing orthodox religion to be the older generations. And what we know about them is that they tended to grow up in a lifestyle that didn't really, you know, celebrate mental health too. So there may be something there too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And I, you know, because I think even in our, you know, in my religion of origin, and, you know, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there have been recently people who, also leaders, who have talked pretty openly about mental health, who have shared some of their own diagnoses, or who have shared some of their own experiences going to therapy or getting professional services, or even with pharmacology, which again I think is wonderful, and that's been a really nice shift to see. I think a lot of times it's kind of like my critique of sexual health. It's like people will say, oh no, we do want to take a sex positive approach, you know, and so you get this one talk or this one person who will say some really great things that are headed in the right direction, but then you still have like 90% of the messages or 90% of the other leaders not really following suit, right? And kind of coming back to older ways of talking about some of these issues. And so I think what we're seeing in my Mormon community is this idea that, yes, it's normalized a little bit more. At the same time, there are still tons of messages that really are what we might consider as mental health practitioners, kind of like putting perfectionism on a pedestal, right? Without necessarily meaning, maybe not having that being the intention, but when religious leaders are not necessarily trained in mental health and they say certain things, especially when the focus is so much on conformity, on certain behavioral standards, or having a certain type of lifestyle and fitting a certain type of, you know, norm within that community, then it's very expected that a person might feel like, well, but I'm not seeing alleviation of these symptoms. I'm not seeing the promises of my worship. So there must be something wrong how I'm worshiping or what I'm doing. I must not be doing enough, right? There must be more that I should be doing, which is that internalized shame cycle that is actually part of depression. Part of anxiety symptoms is to already have that kind of thought process. And that can be, I think, exacerbated by some messages people hear at church, where as a person who doesn't have those kinds of mental health disorders wouldn't necessarily hear that message in the same way as somebody who is struggling with anxiety, depression, PTSD, OCD, you know, all the different things that could potentially be part of what they're struggling with. Yeah, really interesting. So we're here to say both matter. Your spirituality matters, you know, hopefully you're developing a spirituality that is wellness centered, right? And whatever that means for you, for whoever's listening, and whether or not that's part of a religious community or organization. Um, and how can you, prioritize your mental health through things like that? I think it's important to say that, I don't think that religion cures depression, or anxiety or things like that, but it can be a useful tool, just like many other things can be useful tools if they're used correctly and in wellness appropriate ways.
Mhm.
I agree.
Here, here. Yes, absolutely.
All right. So another story that I noticed, I just wanted to point out is so Edna Adan Ismail, I hope I'm saying that correctly. She's a nurse midwife, hospital founder, and healthcare advocate who for decades combated female circumcision and strived to improve women's healthcare in East Africa, was named on Tuesday as the winner of the 2023 Templeton Prize, which is one of the world's largest annual individual awards, and it's valued at $1.5 million, which is really nice. So,
Good for her.
yeah, it's really interesting. I'm going to
And
also,
and frankly, we're being kind calling it female circumcision.
Mm.
It's not near the same process and serves not near the same function as it does with males.
yes, I would agree with that. And that's a lot of what her work has been, is to advocate education. It says here that rooted in her Muslim faith, she receives this year's award for her extraordinary efforts to harness the power of the sciences to affirm the dignity of women and help them to flourish physically and spiritually. And she founded a hospital and university which have significantly reduced maternal mortality in Somaliland. So these, this is one of those things where here's a woman, Muslim woman, who is rooted to her faith, is dedicated to her faith, and yet is going against, maybe some of the norms of her particular country. And she, of course, does not agree that her faith supports female circumcision, right? So,
Mhm.
not to compare her to me at all, right? Because this is like huge work she's doing it. But at the same time, I understand that sense of like loving my faith community, but not agreeing with leaders necessarily on how certain principles are being taught, right? Or that there's not room for different interpretations. And so this is an example of a woman who is doing some really, really important work in that kind of same intersection of her faith that she's devoted to, but also trying to challenge some of the traditions and principles within that country's way of living the faith. She's the first African woman to win the prize. And it says that she has used the teachings of her faith, family, and scientific education to improve the health and opportunities of some of the world's most vulnerable women and girls. She said she would donate some of her prize money to the US-based Friends of Edna Maternity Hospital for use in purchasing new equipment, hiring educators, and training the next generation of healthcare workers that East Africa so desperately needs. She was born in 1937. Her father was a doctor, and she was afforded education that was normally reserved for boys, which qualified her to study in Britain. So that's interesting. And she also has joined the World Health Organization, serving as a regional technical officer for maternal and child health back in the 80s and 90s. It's interesting to see some of her history. I'm going to try to find it here. It says Ismail is an outspoken critic of female genital mutilation, which I think is a better word than circumcision.
I
A
would agree.
painful, yes, a painful and sometimes life-threatening practice performed in some Muslim and non-Muslim societies. When she was 8, her mother subjected her to FGM without the knowledge of her father, who, remember, was a doctor, and he was outraged. And this is some of the things that are very interesting in these traditional, communities, where it's oftentimes a person who also has been damaged in this way, but finds it very important to continue that tradition. So it's very interesting to see that it usually is the mother or a female family member who continues the tradition with her daughters or nieces or things of that nature, granddaughters. As a practicing midwife, she was confronted with grievous complications during childbirth from the FGM scarring, and she was inspired to raise the issue at home after attending a 1976 conference in Sudan about where participants from Muslim countries spoke about its effects. Initially, she shocked her audience and attracted threats. She's not the only person I know who has spoken on this who has received very serious death threats, but also building widespread interest. And she encouraged women to come forward and men to stand up for them. She says, Islam forbids female circumcision. Every day I'm reliving and remembering. I'm recalling that pain that happened to me when I was 7 or 8 years old. The wounds may heal, but the pain never leaves you.
Well, bravo to her. She's an inspiration.
Yeah, she is, for sure.
Or
Yeah.
brava.
A pioneer.
Yes, yes.
I generally love midwives anyway, because I think they're fantastic women who really champion women's health and really kind of embrace women on a journey. But yeah, she's a special one for sure.
Yeah, really, really important work.
Mm-hmm.
She's probably in her 80s, I'm guessing, if she's, she was born in the 30s.
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Last topic we want to talk about is this.
Can I make one more comment on that?
Yes, please.
I think it's just another commentary about how much female sexuality is socially dictated by the society that they live in. I think females and it may not be something that's happening like this, like female genital mutilation, but it is often in many cultures being dictated to you about how you're supposed to do and be with your own sexuality. That can be very blatant, but it also can be very invisible and underhanded too. So for females now, as adults, this is our clientele usually, adults are trying to figure out, okay, how do I take ownership over my own sexuality? This is hard. I'm like, yeah, I get that. It is hard. You've been probably dictated about how you're supposed to be with your own sexuality since you were a baby.
It makes me think about like female desire mutilation, where I think a lot of times drive and desire and just a female's potential for sexuality is just very, in many, many cultures, it's just very suppressed, oppressed, slut shamed, whatever those terms are, where if you're going to present as honorable or worthy or whatever the words are, you really can't be very sexual unless it's in certain parameters, and then very cis heteronormative, and also in a way almost like present in a way that where it's really still more important from the perspective of your spousal relationship versus your own relationship with your own body. So
yes. Yep.
Okay, well, so then the AP News, I found a great article I'm also going to link to. It's called The Wave of Anti-Transgender Bills, which we've been talking about in Republican-led states, which is definitely here in Utah, I think where you live, in Florida as well. Jenny, you're seeing a lot of this. It divides U.S. faith leaders, because I think sometimes, I want to just point out that I think sometimes religion gets a bad rap, right? Like it's the religious right and it's the religious people who are doing all of these kind of discriminatory practices. And yet there are tons of religious leaders that are right there in the fight, right, of inclusive work and acceptance work. So I just want to make sure that we're remembering that there's a wide variety of religious people and religious leaders. So it says here, as Republican governed states across the nation advance myriad bills targeting transgender young people, America's faith leaders are starkly divided in their assessment. Some view the legislation as reflecting God's will, Others voice outrage that Christianity is being invoked to justify laws they view as cruel and hateful, which is definitely the place I land in. I think where we land in is just kind of horrified that that religion is being weaponized, right, against people's rights and people's identities and people's physical care and health care, and so we have, for example, it says U.S. Catholic bishops have rejected the concept of gender transition. They issued guidelines in March to stop Catholic hospitals from assisting in such transitions. This is another issue when we have like religious-based medical institutions then imposing their religious beliefs on medical care for people who are not necessarily of their same faith tradition.
This is an echo of what occurred earlier during the Obama administration with the Affordable Care Act and the way that it required the dispensing of contraception, and that went to the courts, and that was granted some cover under religious freedom that they did not have to do that. So this conflict has been ongoing.
Yes, right. And the SBC has been on record since 2014 asserting that gender transition is contrary to God's design. And SBC is the Southern Baptist Convention. So with one of their leaders saying that gender transition is a blatant attempt to undermine the very order of creation. So again, these interpretations, right? But then you have Serene Jones, who's the president of the Union Theological Seminary in New York City, saying as a Christian leader, it's horrifying to me that Christianity and the Bible are being used by the religious right to bludgeon people through these many bills. To use religious language like that is an abomination. They are threatening the lives and well-being of so many people around the US and the world, because again, remember that here in the United States, we have a lot of impact, and there are many countries that are where it's actually life-threatening to be a gender or sexual minority. So when we are not leading as one of the world's kind of national leaders in ways that are affirming and mental health positive, that really has an impact that's larger than just our countries as well. Jones said it's wrong to cite the Bible in rejecting transgender identity. It wasn't something that the Bible even thought about. The larger message there is a message of love and inclusion. By the latest count, at least 20 states have imposed bans or limits on transgender athletes' sports participation at the K-12 or collegiate level, and at least 18 states have adopted laws or policies, including some blocked by courts, barring gender-affirming medical care, such as puberty blockers, hormone therapy, and surgery for minors. In Oklahoma, State Senator David Ballard cited a biblical passage in introducing what he calls the Millstone Act. I can barely even share this paragraph. A bill that would make it a felony for doctors to provide gender transition procedures to anyone under the age of 26.
Oh boy.
Bullard, who has served as a deacon at his Baptist church, said the act's name alludes to a passage in the book of Matthew suggesting that anyone causing a child to sin should be drowned in the sea with a millstone hung around their neck. So you can see how people's religious convictions and interpretations are being completely mixed in with what we know, WPATH guidelines, mental health guidelines, medical guidelines. And it's also interesting to me to see how, again, from this religious right Republican perspective, how you're taking away the rights of parents to parent their children in ways that they see fit. And anytime that there's anything that, even just sexual education in the public schools, the Republicans might have a fit around the fact that their parental rights are being eradicated because we're just offering education to their children about basic sexual.
And what did he say? Anyone who causes children to sin should be drowned with the millstone around their neck?
Yeah.
So he considers people all the way up to the age of 25 to be children now.
26.
26.
Probably comes from this idea that we've been talking about, that our brains are developing into emerging adulthood, right? And so now, yes.
Well, a lot of people in the mental health community have advocated for a long time that just as a general matter of fact, that's when our brain generally stops developing, is it's finished. For the most part, not that its neuroplasticity ever goes away, but it's done with its like growth and some major things like that. But I find it odd that they apply it in this area where they want to control people, but they don't apply it in areas where it actually grants people. Anyway, I find their use of it really one-sided.
Right.
So a little bit of selective science. Like, we'll take this one part of science, this part, but we're not going to ignore, we're going to ignore all the rest. We're also going to ignore what doctors are saying about their own medical training about how to treat this issue, along with parents. We're going to ignore because their agenda is the correct one. And apparently violence is now okay too. Oh, okay.
Well, in the very beginning of this podcast, Natasha brought up, here we are at the intersection of religion and mental health and
politics.
No, politics wasn't included.
Oh. There's mental health, religion, and sexuality.
Yes.
But yeah, definitely affects politics too.
and then you said something about, and I can't think of anything more controversial or whatever than that. And in my brain, I was like, until the politicians think that they know more than the sex experts or the religious people, or they don't stay in their lane. And here recently, this is politicians telling doctors that they know better.
Yeah, and religious quite frankly, religiously fanatic politicians.
Yes.
That's really where we have landed. This is not just politicians. I'm not even comfortable calling this a religious right at this point. This is like religious fanaticism that has overtaken a part of our country's politics in ways that are very, very scary. In the Texas legislature, it says one of the leading backers is an ordained minister, Representative Steve Toth, and he introduced a bill that proposes making it a felony to provide gender affirming care for minors. We see the same thing even with reproductive care, right? With like abortion care and things of that nature, that now we're gonna make illegal basic healthcare and also certain rights of people to have different values, beliefs about their bodies and their identities. It is just fascinating when we think about this from the perspective of religious freedom, which is also a thing that they like to be very hypocritical about. Is no, it's only religious freedom when it's my freedom to impose my religion onto everybody else. That's the freedom we're really talking about here. Bills in other states have sought to restrict transgender people's use of public restrooms and limit their ability to be called by their pronouns that reflect their gender identity. And in Tennessee, the Tennessee Baptist Convention depicted gender dysphoria as a sexual perversion. So again, these very, big words, provocative words, sex negative words. And we know that all of these things, when these things are happening politically and they're in the news, suicide rates, mental health symptoms, all of, suicidality, everything increases for those within the LGBTQ community. That has been proven over and over again. So yeah, this is really, really concerning. Very, very, very concerning.
And so far, I've been very aware whenever any state passes laws like this, I go and I read the law. Not because I plan on practicing there, but I'm waiting for it to start impacting mental health, because so far everything has been around either chemical interventions, like hormone suppressants or hormone therapy, and surgical interventions, so physical interventions. So this is really affecting people like endocrinologists and doctors and surgeons and things like that. So far, nobody specifically said anything about mental health until just last month in April. Missouri's anti-trans bill states right in the rules that the provider must ensure that any psychiatric symptoms from existing mental health comorbidities, sorry, can't talk this morning, of the patient have been treated and resolved. And when asked to explain what that means, they said that treating other mental health problems must be done before anything else as far as gender affirming care goes. But
Which
it's
is ridiculous.
impossible to untangle those sometimes
Mhm.
because it is the fact that they're not transitioning that's causing the mental health issue. So we have this endless chicken and the egg argument going on here, to where it puts it all on the mental health professionals to say this person is now what? Completely mental, they're have a 100% mental health checkup. Now they can be passed on. I don't know. That's
Yeah.
some dangerous,
And again,
that's
it totally
concerning
ignores,
territory.
yeah, it ignores everything we know about LGBTQ affirming care.
Mhm.
Um, and effective care, effective care. And, I just did a podcast with Lisa Hansen, Dr. Lisa Hansen, on this, who runs Flourish Therapy here in Salt Lake City. And she talked about how gender affirming care is like extremely effective in lowering suicide rates.
Mhm.
And sometimes there's school systems and all kinds of systems that will spend millions of dollars on suicide effectiveness and might see a 2 to 4% reduction. But this is like much larger reduction, like 50% reduction in suicidality. Why would we not be like jumping at the possibility that we could decrease suicide reduction by having effective treatment? But instead, here we are in this political climate.
Well, none of the states, counties, or federal government, no government at any level wants to pay a mental health provider unless they're using treatment modalities that are proven to work. Well, here's one that's proven to work.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, on a positive note, in various communities, including Knoxville, Tennessee, Madison, Wisconsin, interfaith groups of both moderate and liberal religious leaders have held events to show support for transgender people and denounce the wave of anti-trans legislation. Such an event took place in Pasadena in March, bringing together Christian, Jewish, and Muslim leaders for a news conference at an Episcopal congregation that embraces LGBTQ inclusion. Reverend Pat Langlois, who's a senior pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church United Church of Christ in the Valley, says, if our voices can be heard by some trans kid in Kentucky, realizing there are faith leaders who've got their back, they might hang on a little bit longer. This is what's so important, right? So it is important for faith leaders to stand up and to say things. These bills are the most vitriolic and cruel legislation I've seen. I have a non-binary teenager, so I take this very personally, not just as a person of faith and as a lesbian, but as a mom. This is another thing that I think the religious right has been for some reason, very effective, is that only religious people are cis and heterosexual, right? Whereas, here's a person saying, I'm a lesbian, I'm a person of faith, I'm a mom of a non-binary kid, right? It's non-religious people who are against religious people. There's tons of religious people, tons of people of faith that have very different views than these orthodox, or kind of like I'm saying, very discriminatory spaces. Her worries were compounded when the rector of All Saints, Mike Kinman, told his congregation that the church had received 2 threats. A bomb would be detonated during Sunday worship, and that someone would come to service with a gun to kill the pastor. So again, people are really, like, the violence in this is so interesting too, right? Like that religiously orthodox people or fanatical people would think that violence and death and murder is an answer, like a religiously anointed answer to some of these things, which is always so fascinating when people get to that point. So they've had to deploy security guards.
Tend to go out the door at that moment, don't they?
The what?
I said the 10 Commandments tend to go out the door at that moment.
Yeah, there's a lot of justification for the exceptions of basic principles that I think we would find in most religious communities. Basic principles. The leader of one of the largest mainline Protestant denominations, Reverend Elizabeth Eaton of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, has condemned the anti-trans bills as an attack on trans people's humanity. Our church teaches that we affirm transgender and non-binary siblings as God's children. And as for U.S.
That
Catholics,
actually surprises me. I mean, and I'm saying that as somebody that was raised Lutheran. So, yeah, that's
right, but
that's an amazing statement, actually.
There's been movement in a lot of these congregations from the 70s, from the 80s, from the 90s. I know in some of these churches, like Lutheran denominations and things, there's been huge rifts because of these,
yes.
These types of debates within religious communities as well. Even for U.S. Catholics, there are diverse views among church personnel. So the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has told Catholic hospitals they must not perform interventions, whether surgical or chemical, that aim to transform the sexual characteristics of a human body into those of the opposite sex. But yet some parish priests, including a pastor here, they're not mentioning their name, have welcomed transgender people into their congregations and honored their decisions to transition. In March, several thousand Catholic nuns representing orders across the U.S. signed a statement urging people to oppose anti-transgender legislation in their states. As members of the body of Christ, we cannot be whole without the full inclusion of transgender, non-binary, and gender-expansive individuals, the statement said. So this is really fascinating, and I'm just hoping, it's interesting how moderate, when we talk about moderate politics, they don't tend to be as loud as the extreme politics. Mm-hmm. And extreme politics and politicians are very adept at being loud and abrasive and getting a lot of attention. And those of us who are maybe in more moderate spaces are not as comfortable with those types of tactics because we see them as propaganda or as falsifying information. And so, but it's interesting how sometimes those loud strategies actually have very scary ways of working. So I think we need to figure out how to be loud and that's why I use terms like fanaticism. That's why I use terms like that, because I'm like, no, this is not okay. This is not just a difference of opinion. This is fanatic behavior that is harmful to many, many people in our own country and other countries. And we need to call it out. And I think that that's a role of advocacy, even within mental health professionals. And I think sometimes as mental health professionals, we're very diplomatic. We're very much trying to see both sides. We're trying to make space for all different kinds of opinions and beliefs. But in some spaces, we have to stand up and say, no, this is not an area of health. We have crossed a line here.
That I think we could, the example that I think of most comes to mind, easiestly comes to mind when you talk about we need to speak up, we need to be noisy, was in the early days of, the AIDS movement among the LGBTQ community. One of the most popular and effective sayings ever put out there was silence equal death. And, it's like, we can't, too much is at risk. We have to speak up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I think the politicians that are pushing the fanatic type of agendas have not sat down and had a conversation with any of the people that they think that they are trying to protect. They're not listening to the story. I mean, it's clear that they have their own agenda in place, which is their own viewpoint. And that viewpoint is harmful to a lot of people.
And I think that highlights the difference I was referring to earlier, where it's like the church leaders are all passing these policies and saying, our religious hospitals shouldn't do this, and we shouldn't tolerate this, and we shouldn't accommodate that. But then you start getting down to kind of the boots on the ground level, where people actually do interact with the people that they're making rules about. Yeah. And once again, Catholics, guys, you've let the nuns out compassion you. They usually do. And, then it's in the congregations, in these individual congregations, you hear dissenters saying, well, yeah, I know they said that, but here in our congregation, we're accepting, or here in our congregation, we look at it with compassion. And it's when you actually just start meeting them as real people that you realize that we are all God's children.
Yeah. Stacey Jackson Roberts, so glad you're listening. She's doing the work. She says, and ACT UP changed the conversation,
Oh,
which
huge.
is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. So I'm going to be sharing a link to that as well. And Paul Ship says, I want to scream. It's a human rights issue. Totally agreed. So yeah, this is let's scream. Let's get loud. let's up the voices, because sometimes, yeah, and even your comment, Jenny, it's so interesting because you would think that, right? You would think, I mean, that's been a big thing, is like we can stop discrimination, we can stop, we can educate through shared stories, through getting to know people, and we do see that a lot, even like with within the LDS community. So many families have become much more affirming because they are like, oh, I didn't realize I had a gay son or a trans kid or a non-binary kid, so once you start caring about people, you're like, oh, I'm willing to shift my perspective. My lived experience is now shifting my ways of thinking, which is a very, very powerful way to do some of this work. At the same time, I am extremely frustrated when I know, for example, that many, many gay, lesbian, trans, non-binary folks have sat with these politicians, with church leaders, our church leaders, in one-on-one interviews, have shared their pain, their stories on multiple occasions, and it is not moving the needle for some of these people. And I don't know if it's because people are so invested in their political motivations, if they're so invested in their religious leadership, if they're so invested in this approach that they cannot even have the humanity of stories shift and soften their hearts, right? Which again are at the principles of most religious communities: humility, softening of hearts, opening of hearts, love, compassion. And yet we don't see that.
All very relationship oriented, right? But if that's a common human dilemma, the tension between relationships, being relationship friendly and protecting your own ego.
Yeah.
Either one could be cloudy. So if these people are sitting down with leaders and they're not connecting, and the leaders is not wanting to connect, other than like a shallow, that's a bummer. I mean, these politicians are making, people can leave, right, a religion, but you can't leave your legal system of the country. That would be very difficult to do that. So the politics and these policies do have pretty important impact on us, all of us, not just the one that they're targeting.
Yeah, and if you're a minor, you can't leave your religion usually, right? Because your parents are kind of in charge of that. And we know through the work of faith transition that even if you do leave your faith tradition of origin, it's extremely painful. It causes huge effects of ostracization, of identity work, like you said, Jenny, like so much of that work that is unnecessary tragedy at this point. We should know better. We should be doing better. I wish Maya Angelou was always correct in that when we know better, we'll do better. I hope that's the trajectory in general, but I feel like there are many people who do know better, should know better, and don't do better. And that's a tragedy.
It is.
All right. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for joining me today for this awesome conversation. Lots of interesting things happening. If there's a news story or happening that you're aware of that we're not addressing, that you'd like for us to address, please either here at my page, Natasha Helfer, or the Symmetry Solutions page, please reach out to us. Send us articles, send us things you want us to address, send us questions, etc. And we would love to hear from you. So take care, Allan. Take care, Jenny.
Absolutely. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. No so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the